is an Emmy-winning director, filmmaker, and activist. She founded Survivor Love Letter, which is a movement that celebrates survivors of sexual assault. And she also co-founded Immediate Justice, which connects girls with filmmakers to tell powerful stories. We also have with us Jasmine Uribe from Break the Cycle, and she is the Chief Operating Officer and has been a leader in dating abuse prevention for 15 years. She's experienced in working with youth and communities and has developed curricula and prevention education efforts, advocacy and campaign strategies, and developed training for youth leadership and community activism. We have Tara DeMont from Amnesty International USA from our DC headquarters. She is the director of the Gender, Sexuality, and Identity Program, leading the organization's work on women's rights, LGBTI rights, the rights of Indigenous peoples, and sexual and reproductive rights. And last but definitely not least, we have Aiden Stark-Chessa, who is coming to us from SafeBae, and he is a passionate entrepreneur, advocate, and member of the Maine Boys to Men Youth Advisory Council and board member for SafeBae. So thank you again to all the panelists for being here. I want to start the conversation with Tara. And can you talk to us about gender-based violence from a global perspective and what its root causes and contributing factors are?
Yeah, absolutely. It's really good to see some familiar faces online and meet new folks. So the thing about gender-based violence, so gender-based violence is committed against people because of their sex or their gender or perceived sex and gender. And violence against women and girls is one form of gender-based violence. And it's number the most prevalent form. So you hear a lot of folks talking about violence against women and girls as interchangeable with gender-based violence, but I do want to highlight, of course, that there are other types of gender-based violence committed against trans people, violence committed against people for being perceived to be gay or for being gay, etc. When we're talking about ending GBV, particularly in this context of violence against women and girls, the important thing is to know that it's a global phenomenon. So that means in tuning our own home communities here in the United States, there's no place where there isn't gender-based violence and violence against women and girls, but that also extends globally. And that produces a number of challenges, but also opportunities for solidarity and understanding, right? Because what at root, it's the same cause, which is patriarchal overvaluation of men and devaluation of women, and also understanding biological sex and gender as somehow a binary, that like men are different than women and these are the roles different people should play, right? So a lot of this is rooted in how we as individuals within our own cultures and then globally in culture understand our own genders, understand how sex and gender link or don't link, and understand then like what the value is of those things. So really when you're thinking about the root causes of inequality and inequity, and this goes for lots of different types of inequality and inequity too, at the root is a belief structure about who we are in opposition to other people. And in this case, who men are in opposition to women, right? Which already is really problematic way of thinking about sex and gender, which is not a dichotomy, which is so much more to identity. But if you reject that and you need to then enforce gender roles to make sure that happens, one of the gender roles you're enforcing is about male dominance and female subservience. And that can look like either domestic roles, whether traditional, like who works outside the home, who stays inside the home, or who makes decisions, who doesn't make decision, who has political power, who doesn't have political power, right? So at the root of gender-based violence is the same thing that's at the root of women's inequality in the workplace. Is it the same thing that's at the root of the lack of representation in political structures worldwide? And that's sexism, right? Which stems from patriarchy. So when we talk about combating gender-based violence, and violence against women and girls particularly, we need to think not only about the short-term things we need to do to make sure survivors have what they need, but also combating the attitudes that get us to the point where violence is enacted on people, which means not only thinking about our survivors, but what it is that we're teaching perpetrators of violence, right? We spend a lot of time in our country too, but globally thinking about survivors as well we should, and the things that they need. And we're not as good at thinking about perpetrators of violence and how we make sure that before that violence happens, that we stop that violence, right? So it's that global phenomena that we see, gender-based violence, violence against women and girls knows no class, it knows no nation. There is no category, subcategory of women or girl who is immune to violence against women and girls, right? Now, there are certainly factors that intersect with people's gender identity that make them particularly more vulnerable to violence because they have less access to resources or less vulnerable, but it really is something that spans the globe, spans caste and class, spans race and ethnicity, spans even gender identity.
Thank you for that very thorough response, and for the clarification of gender-based violence, not just being about women and girls, which I think is very important. So we are living in unprecedented times through COVID-19, and we know from a domestic perspective that the domestic violence hotline, for example, has received an influx of calls, and especially from young people. So this question kind of goes out to all of you, but I wonder if Jasmine and Aiden could maybe shed some light on how this is affecting young people, especially. Yes, how is this affecting young people? Jasmine, do you want to start?
Sure, just making sure I wasn't on mute. So similar, you can think about when we talk about domestic violence, I feel like now there's been a lot more attention and awareness to understand that domestic violence, in fact, happens in young relationships, but there's different choice words, right? There's relationship violence, intimate partner violence, teen dating violence. The reality still is that in that relationship, there's a dynamic of power and control. So I feel like dating abuse or relationship violence has always been around. I think we can all think back to being 14 or 15, and maybe those relationships were just a bad relationship or a relationship filled with drama. At least that's what I would have called it, being a survivor of dating violence. I didn't know those terms until I was in college. So how it's affecting young people, the patterns are very similar to what happens with adults. Now, in the times of COVID, what we've been seeing a lot at Break the Cycle is more of our young people coming and asking for resources around cyber abuse or digital abuse or abuse facilitated by technology. So basically, just because they're not face to face doesn't mean that they're not experiencing abuse. So the first myth to kind of dispel is that abuse has to be just physical. It's not. Sexual abuse is not just rape or sexual assault. Sexual abuse and physical abuse, emotional abuse, they can all happen online. So what we've been seeing is a bigger trend in asking for resources around digital abuse and online safety, and a trend also in with our legal service team, seeing clients needing protection orders and seeing those things kind of stack up with child custody. So when we think about young people and teens who may experience abuse, we also have to remember that these are young parents. These are teens who are parenting, who are now dealing with the physical restrictions of child visitation or not wanting to have a child go to their ex-partner's house because of COVID worries. So there's been a lot more concerns, I think, around boundaries online and offline. And I'll pause because I'm sure Aiden has more to add there.
Aiden, I actually was curious if you could speak to also how kids are handling the mental health, because I know SafeBae often, discusses mental health issues. So throwing that at you in the middle.
Yeah, of course. Well, first of all, I'd love to just highlight 2 points. First of all, I loved what Jasmine said about how there's this misconception that online really is sort of secondary to abuse in person. And I think that we really need to work hard to dispel that idea, because that is really a misconception. I think that seeing firsthand how it is potentially much easier to experience abuse online than it is in person. And I don't know that for a fact, but from what I've seen through my peers and friends, it's really easy to get sucked into rabbit holes online and not really have a place to go because it's not really normalized in our culture, and there isn't a as clear of a path. You don't know what to do as much. And secondly, I think that the real change, at least from my perspective, that COVID brought about is with young people, and I guess with everybody, socially, everything got flipped on its head. You don't have the support that you used to have through friends and peers and allies because you don't see them in person, and it's more difficult to communicate and seek help. In addition, from the mental health side, I think that there is this COVID sort of forced all of us to confront that we're not in control. And that wasn't, at least to me, evident in each aspect of my life until COVID hit. And I was like, I cannot control really anything in my life anymore. And that was scary for me. And I'm sure that was scary for other youth. And I'm sure that was scary for adults as well. And I think that from the mental health side, it took me several months to sort of grapple with the idea that I really need to adjust the way I live to be more in line with the fact that I don't really know what is going to take place tomorrow or the next day and how I'm going to have to adjust my actions.
Thank you. Tani, with Survivor Love Letter, I feel like it's such a powerful thing to write a letter to yourself as a survivor, which is how it was started. You writing a letter to yourself after your own sexual assault. And I kind of thought maybe throughout this pandemic, especially as more people are writing letters to themselves, have you seen any kind of positive response, or what are the responses you've seen through Survivor Love Letter and maybe some of the other work you do through this pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I'd love to back up and maybe talk a little bit about how the project started, because it really resonates with what Jasmine and Aiden were talking about. Because as a young person, on the anniversary of my rape, which is on Valentine's Day, I wrote a love letter to my younger self, and I shared it on Twitter using the hashtag Survivor Love Letter. And so that went viral. You know, I started to connect with survivors all over the world. And so, you know, thinking about survivors who are isolated right now during COVID, it mirrors that kind of response that we're talking about right now, where we're trying to find solutions during a time of isolation. And so, you know, for me, this project has been incredibly organic. You know, it was something that I was doing for myself to find a community. And I think when you struggle with PTSD and depression and anxiety as a young person, oftentimes it's hard to leave your own home. And so you find that community online. And so what's interesting is, since Survivor Love Letter is such an online project, on Instagram and other social media platforms like Twitter and TikTok, young people have been reaching out, I think, more than ever, and talking about some of the issues that have been happening at home. And so we were not set up as a hotline. We were not set up to intervene in situations of domestic abuse or violence. But during COVID, we have had to really figure out, like, how do we meet the needs that are coming up? And most of the people that we serve are young folks between the ages of 18 and early 20s. And they're mostly young women of color and non-binary folks. And we also do not involve law enforcement. We're interested in a transformative justice model. And so the idea of the survivor love letter circle has been really important, that survivors can support one another. And so, you know, in one case study, we had a survivor use her love letter to explain what was happening at home. And she used this love letter to then share it out to adults and other people, so that she could get the help and services that she needed. And her survivor love letter circle were close friends who then acted as a close ring of support. So rather than involving law enforcement, this was a close group of people that could continue to give her love and support during a very difficult time. And so I think, you know, what we're realizing is that during COVID, there's a lot of social services that are kind of disappearing. And we're trying to empower young people to find the resources and support within their own communities and to know that they have those things.
Perfect. That brings me to perfectly into my next question, which I will start with Tara on, but I think that Jasmine and maybe some of you can also enlighten us. Tara, how do you think governments have failed from a global human rights perspective to protect people from gender-based violence?
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, sorry, I was just gonna say, like, in every way. So in every possible way. I mean, so one of the things, right, and I can get to the specifics around COVID specifically, but you know, your human rights, you have the right, the government is obligated to respect, protect, and fulfill that right. So what that means is your right to live free from violence means the government has to respect that right. They have to not commit that abuse, right? They have to respect the right that you live free from violence. They cannot commit that abuse. Obviously, we see that happening all the time in the US government and lots of governments committing violence against folks, and gender-based violence, right? An example in Mexico that I know AmnestyLA from the Women's Code Group has worked on, where police are actively engaged in gender-based violence. I mean, we see instances of here in the United States, particularly around rape cases. So that's what respecting it means. Protecting the right, your right to live free from violence, means that the government has to ensure that someone else doesn't commit that. They have to protect you from that right. And the first way you do that in a law and justice society is you have a law so that it's illegal for someone to commit that type of violence against you, right? But it's not enough to just pass a law. You have, in a law and justice society, you have that law, but you then have to, like, protect, respect, fulfill that right. So you have to make sure that it's real for you. So it's not enough that the government says, well, look, we're not committing the violence. Not always true, but like, we're not committing the violence. And we've got this law on the book that says, like, you can't actually beat someone up if they're your spouse. Again, not always true. Like, therefore, we're done here. The government is obligated by their own admission, by their own treaties, to fulfill that right. And that's where you see these failures of spikes of rates of violence in COVID, for example, that these aren't like overnight, all of a sudden, like law and order fell apart over COVID. It's like a total failure of a government to build a society in which we respect each other's rights, particularly in which we respect the rights of women and girls, right? And so in what you have then is, when you have situations like COVID, which bring with them, and there's lots of other sort of earth-changing examples in small communities or in individual lives, whether it's a full global pandemic or not, which exacerbate the circumstances which tend to find higher rates of domestic or intimate partner violence, or teen dating violence, or online violence against women and girls. Like, those are external factors that a government can't control, a global pandemic, although they can certainly do something to try and end it better, right? But what they failed in is creating a society in which, when you have those stressors, let's say, of unemployment rise, or you have those stressors of, like, I mean, all the stress we feel of, like, not knowing what's going on, and like global health scares, that those don't then spike rates of violence against women and girls. It's not like COVID is somehow this magical violence tool. It's all the things that we're living with that the government has failed to address, which is, accurate fact-based sex information, sex ed and sex education for children, gender-sensitive education in schools, justice-focused and restorative justice, as Tani was saying, restorative justice approaches to community restoration when there are acts of violence or whatever it is, again, like survivor-led, but that there are other options than like an over-criminalization of a community, which then spills in more and more and more. So all that to say, the answer is like in every way. And then in COVID specifically, right, what we've seen, and this is really global, and we've seen it play out here in our own communities in the United States, and we've seen it in almost every other place, is when you've had these public health lockdowns where folks, and people were talking earlier, I'm from California too, my parents are going into another, state-based lockdown. You have these lockdowns happen where for health reasons, they're saying, please don't go outside and lick flagpoles, you're going to kill people. So people need to stay inside, but they don't then have any services, like any rise in services, any rise in terms of like for a domestic violence hotline or in terms of social services. There's no safety net in which we catch folks then who, as Aidan was talking about, are now super extra isolated, as opposed to the isolation of everyday technology in life are extra isolated. There's no services being targeted towards that the government has extra funded, right? There's no support system for social workers to be able to like deal with the over caseloads that are coming. And of course, we've seen like the failures in the news of like the physical COVID health part, right? Now, if you take that and then I'll wrap, I promise, but in a global context, all those frontline workers are being pulled off of non-essential jobs and into the, like, our hospitals are overflowing, we need PPE, personal protective equipment, et cetera, because we have this health crisis. So even the small amount of resources that were there for dealing with this major global health crisis, which is gender-based violence, are now being pulled to this other pressing health crisis. So it's not that like COVID somehow caused this problem. It's that like COVID has laid bare that governments have failed across the board to deal with this, so that we get to this panic point and there's no services. There's no cultural, in any culture, there's no cultural basis for which we can prevent this from happening or spiking. And then there's no justice or reparations when it does happen.
I think what you said is so on point, because COVID really has just revealed our weaknesses and like where we haven't been there for the people that need help, and for people in general. So I wonder, does anyone have anything to add to that, like from a different perspective, where you feel like maybe government could step up more?
Yeah, I would just add that when you think about who our essential workers are, also think disproportionately about all the women of color who are essential workers, and just the economic disparity. And so statistically, the economic pressure now on women of color makes it so that there are statistically more women of color that are now in dire domestic abuse and more dangerous situations. And that's a lot of the data that we're finding now.
I just wanted to add to, Tara had me all fired up and pumped up when you were saying, I was like, yes, I was probably nodding my head like a bobblehead. But even if you break it down, the way I see it is like COVID is not this, violence, inside or whatever. It's kind of that mirror that's going to hold to our infrastructures, and the fact that we lack in true community-centered, reformative, transformative changes and structures. I mean, I think about healing in general, and you brought up mental health, Justine. This is just shedding like a magnifying glass or a mirror, how cracked our system is. So I just wanted to echo that. But even from the very beginning, I know I would hear, it comes down to language too. So you have all this scary stuff about staying at home, and then the slogan was safe at home. And I was like, safe at home is not safe for everyone. And I thought about people who are at home and living with violence, and how that statement alone, just a very casual, put together slogan that was going to be catchy, can affect you to think, well, I'm not really safe at home. I should feel safe at home, and add that pressure onto it. So everything that Tara said, but plus I kept thinking about government and just policies and structure down to the most general language that they use is not fully community-centered or survivor-focused. And that's the problem. And we're going to continue to have these problems, COVID or not, because we're not investing into our communities and restructuring how funding is being placed. So I'm just hoping that from this, we see more ways of support to the people that really need it. You know, I get cringe a little every time I see a notice come out about everything that's going to be closed, but there's a lack in what resources are available if someone needs immediate support, counseling. So like if we can challenge people to even check your lingo in the messages you're sending on the government side, just remember, safe at home is not safe for everyone. And I've had to reiterate that. So that's the only thing that popped up, but thank you for firing me up, Sarah.
Yeah, always. I mean, I just look back to what Aiden was talking about too. Wait, here, I'll lower my hand. Sometimes I try and Zoom real fancy, raise my hand. That, you know, what Aiden was talking about too, about the isolation, particularly that young folks are feeling, and like we're all, I think so many of us are feeling that. Everyone on this call probably feels that, right? And I really appreciate these opportunities to connect. And, you know, schooling from 0 to 12th grade or 1st to 12th grade are these places where for some kids it becomes the safest space you have is your school. Now that's not always true for folks, right? But for some kids that becomes the safest place you can go, becomes the only place you're getting food, it becomes, you know, et cetera, that like for young people, and the UN defines young people all the way to 24, right? That this online space is can be particularly life-giving. And now that it is like the only point of interaction, and it's also, and Amnesty has done reporting on this, it's also a place where we're seeing a rise in abuse. And that's as my colleagues could talk about, the way that like the way of abuse is isolation and cutting off communication and power and control. And when you have an external force sort of doing some of that already, like you're stuck inside because of safety reasons, but now you're isolated, you don't have those other things. And particularly for young people for whom that socialization is so built into the everyday for most young people, of going to school and having that socialization and good and bad experiences, but like having those outlets, now that online space is even more dangerous, right? And like one of the things that folks, and I see a couple of familiar faces on the Zoom, but like folks who've worked in intimate partner violence and domestic violence know very well that it's still sometimes, but particularly before, it was so hard to convince people that intimate partner violence and domestic violence was, one, real, and like two, was like a public issue and not just a private issue. And folks would say like, well, why don't you leave, right? And it'd be like, well, that's not always an option for folks for lots and lots of reasons. And if you transfer that now to thinking about this online space and online violence against women and girls and online violence against genderqueer folks and online violence against young people, be like, well, why don't you just get offline? Well, we live online. Life is online. Like I talk to my parents more via Zoom than I do in person any day. All my work is online. My bills are online. My social interactions online. So that's even more pressing now with COVID, because online is so much of our interaction. So I just really want to highlight what Aiden was saying earlier about that online space and that isolation for young people and the increased risk of online violence, which has the same psychological impacts as in-person physical violence can have, right? But is so much more invisible and taken so much less seriously. So just want to flag that. And I'll put in the chat, and I'm sure a couple of other folks will, hopefully the service providers and Break the Cycle, a couple of numbers and information if you or someone you know is experiencing intimate partner violence, to know that there are resources out there. So we'll make sure and flag those in the chat, and I'm sure in the follow-up email that AmnestyLA will send out as well.
Thank you. So Tani's, did you want to add something, Tani?
Yeah, and I think this might actually go into your question, because it's such an important conversation, because I know for a lot of young people, young survivors, how they interface with media is oftentimes, you know, something they say that, like, or their story goes viral online, and then the media catches wind of it, and all of a sudden they become like this young survivor media darling for the worst thing that ever happened to them. And once they get older, then there's another young survivor that kind of takes this weird survivor spotlight, you know, and I think we all do it because like we want to end violence. But it in the media cycle, it's this vicious cycle, and it actually, there's a lot of online bullying that happens to survivors for then getting this attention. So, it's something that amongst survivors that are advocates, especially this year, after the passing of Daisy Coleman, it's something that we got together and talked about, especially, harassment online, and also, who gets to talk, who does the media choose, and typically it's young, attractive white female survivors. And so, you can see that in the trajectory or history of the Me Too movement and how it started. How we all know it started with Melissa Alana. But then also there's people like Loretta Ross, who are incredible survivors, Black survivors, who I think need to be elevated in the conversation. And so I think with Survivor Love Letter, we've been trying to really figure out how do we think about all of the different forms of media that are at our disposal. There's social media, there's film, there's a number of different technologies, and how do we put survivors at the center of being the storytellers to create our own media, so that the media is not just telling our stories for us. And that has been a really important part of how we can start to take back the power, and also make sure that we are telling more stories of women of color and trans survivors, not in a way that tokenizes us, but really values us as whole human beings. And then another thing I just wanted to add is also making sure that like our stories as narratives are not just about our trauma, but also about our resilience. So we're not just people who have had harm done to us, but we're also artists, we're also filmmakers, we're also athletes. Like I think in charting our stories of violence, it's also to chart the story of resilience that had happened alongside that.
Yeah. And you've actually led me to two questions that I want to ask you all. But I'll start with the one about media and entertainment in particular for you and for Aiden, because I know SafeBae does a lot with filmmaking as well. But I'd love to hear from you both on your perspective of the media's and the entertainment industry's responsibility when we tell these stories, how we tell them, who's telling them. Because I feel like there is a responsibility to, tell these stories with responsibility. So if you could elaborate and like share your perspective on, what the media and entertainment industry should take into mind when they are telling these stories.
Yeah, well, I think first and foremost, from the side of the media, when I believe that the media has a responsibility to strive for the truth and the whole truth as much as they possibly can, and I think that inherent within that is highlighting every story and every aspect of each story, and making sure to bring to the limelight people's stories who may not be focused on before then. And so I think that I think there is an absolute responsibility when you are in the media, when you're a journalist, when you are working to bring these stories to light, you're not really doing your job unless you are highlighting every different story from every person who you can, and telling the whole broad truth. And then I think that it gets a little bit more interesting when you talk about filmmaking. And I personally believe that that everybody has a moral responsibility to tell the whole diverse truth. But I also see why other people might make other decisions. Maybe they feel it would make people more money to stray from telling the whole truth. And maybe that is why they're making that decision. And I think that it's important, first and foremost, to understand why people make decisions. But I actually think that that is the conception that one kind of storytelling might be more lucrative, or one kind of storytelling might fulfill your purpose better. I think that that's a fallacy, and I'm not sure that that is actually true. I think that telling a compelling story from every angle and about every person really does pay off in the long term, and it from the stance of film and television and really all different types of media, it really pays off to tell the whole story in all of its nuance. And I also think it's the correct moral thing to do.
Thank you. Tani, did you want to add to that, or?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where when you're moving from nonprofit to entertainment, there's the thing that you want people to do, which is like see and accept more stories by women of color, folks of color. And then there's the market, which is driven by what people want to consume. And so it's one of these things where when you're pitching projects to a network, they have different interests. They don't necessarily want to do what's just like right for the world to end violence against women. And so, you know, like some of the strategies that we've come up with is to serialize things. So instead of doing a single film, if you do a series, that's one way to take, you know, a well-known story or somebody who may be more high profile, and then also add in some of the stories that are maybe lesser known but will be important in the canon of stories. So that's one way to get stories that are going to be important, that a larger audience might not have been able to see otherwise. And sort of this, a similar tactic is like, how do you get sort of celebrities or influencers to also partner in social media campaigns with other people that have stories that are maybe lesser known. And I also think that like this is like a way in which I think like cisgendered men can like be involved in this fight, and also like white allies can also be involved too, because sometimes it's kind of like people will want to take up less space, but this is a way that you can also advocate in some of these spaces and use your privilege.
So I want to ask a couple more questions before we go into the Q&As. We've talked about women of color a few times, and I want to hear from actually each of you how gender-based violence particularly impacts vulnerable populations like people of color, like communities of color, like immigrant communities and refugees as well. Maybe Tara, you want to start with like the global perspective?
Happy to. Yeah, the whole wide world in 30 easy seconds. I mean, so I'll just use our own country as an example, but these sort of things reverberate out, and there's very few exceptions to this, right? One of the things I'd say, and this is one of the questions someone asked, is like, what can we do when, you know, it's people don't take this seriously, particularly online violence? And so one of it, and I think Tani was just speaking so well, is like, what stories are you telling, and whose stories are you highlighting? And when someone's speaking to you and using language that's exclusionary, how do you call them come in and like gently correct them if they're your friend, or maybe forcefully correct them if they're being an asshole, whatever that is for you, right? Like how are you telling those stories and making sure people are visible? So that's one thing. And I think the other is to look at the issues that face us, and there are so dang many that face us as a nation right now, and understand the role that gender-based violence plays in all of them. So if you think about, if you are new to Amnesty or have been working on another subject, one of our flagship campaigns is on ending gun violence in the United States, right? It's gun violence, which is a major human rights crisis, it's a major health crisis, it's also a major racist crisis in the United States. And also the question of gender-based violence looms extremely large in this topic. And so if you're looking at a topic and you think, this is a topic that's clearly about race because, and it very well is, right? The way that racist policies have created a gun crisis, the way that racist policies have created a gun crisis with police against communities of color, et cetera. But you also want to think about the way that the question of violence against women and girls and gender-based violence more broadly fits in, right? So for example, in households where there's a gun, in a domestic violence or an intimate partner situation, I mean, obviously this will seem really obvious, but then the fatality rate just is bonkers higher than when there's no gun. And it could be any other weapon involved, right? But the fatality rate just skyrockets when there's guns involved. And so thinking about the way that a gun violence crisis that looks very different in lots of communities is also a gender-based violence crisis, and the way that a gender-based violence crisis is also a gun crisis, right? So thinking about the questions that really make those issues more complex. And it can be a little daunting because those issues are already very mega and sort of hard to think about good solutions, but making sure that you and I aren't further making invisible the people who are potentially victims of gender-based violence. I think that's particularly true with the question of refugee and migrants, and thinking about the folks that the way that the United States policy on refugees, we have dropped our refugee admission. The current president on his way out has dropped the refugee admission to the lowest it's ever been since the United States began taking refugees, right? Well, that has tons of implications for loads of people in terms of violence, because one of the main reasons people are seeking refugee status is because of violence, but it has particular implications in terms of gender-based violence, right? So again, it's thinking complicatedly about these issues. And it doesn't mean then just being like, oh God, it's so complicated and there's no one easy answer, but making sure that the conversations that you're in or your lawmaker is having include gender-based violence. And the border, I think that the created border crisis by the US government is a great example in which we're seeing particularly the way that the former Attorney General had changed had tried to change interpretations of the United States law, which in general is actually fairly good on asylum seeking. The law is written fairly well, not perfect, but like the United States just doesn't follow its own laws, but tried to change it so gender-based violence was no longer a ground for asylum. So that, say, for example, a woman fleeing north from Central America because she faced gender-based violence, that's not real violence. It had to be some sort of, other type of violence. So again, making sure that as you are fighting for the important changes in your communities and fighting for important changes in our country, and there are so many we're going to need to face, that question of gender-based violence doesn't get lost and those populations don't become invisible, right? I would highlight that particularly for Native American and Alaskan Native folks in the United States, that invisibility is really, really critical. For trans people who suffer the highest rates of gender-based violence than any other gender group in the United States. Just really, again, it doesn't mean you have to have the answer all the time, but making sure that those folks aren't invisible as you're trying to seek changes. So as you do the good thing that you care a lot about, maybe that's the border, maybe that's the environment, whatever it is that really drives you, that you're also making sure that the people who are particularly vulnerable to gender-based violence aren't left out of your solution.
Thank you. Does anyone want to add to that before I hop to my last question and then go to Q&As? You answered for everyone, Tara. You did a great job. Okay, so I know we got to get to the Q&A, so I just want to ask one final question. This one's particularly for Aiden, but if anyone wants to jump in, please feel free to. So there's a reason we have at least one male panelist here, and that is because male allyship is important, but also because, as Tara and the others have alluded to, men are also victims. So we want to make sure men are part of the conversation. Can you speak to us about the importance of male allyship, but also like what is the work you're doing why is this important for men to be talking about, to be involved in, to be working on?
Yeah, I mean, thank you so much for that question. And I think that it is super important to include all people in this, because I believe that this issue is incredibly important. I think that it's, well, first of all, it's important to have male allyship, because I think that in a number of cases, this issue sort of starts and ends with men. You sort of have to inspire. Like, my passion in this work is talking to young male identified people about gender pressures and how the world of masculinity affects them, and sort of talking about how they have also not been the gender system has not treated them super fairly either. And I love talking about ways to be masculine in a healthy way. And so I think that a reason male identified people should be included in this is because every time male identified people begin to learn how to be healthily masculine in a healthy way, they be it it really increases just the ability in our world to have these conversations and overcome these issues. Sorry, that was getting my thoughts lined up. Then sorry, what was the second part of that question?
Just how do you, what are you doing? What is, how are you engaging men and young boys, I guess?
That's an awesome question too. I think that personally, I think that this issue is hard to and from a top-down perspective. I think that you can create legislation, you can talk to swaths of people and try to convince them and try to teach them. But I think that what really is going to begin moving the needle on this issue is having conversations, fostering conversations one-on-one and in small groups of people. So really, I think the biggest way I contribute to this is trying to raise these conversations with my friends and peers, and talk about this world with all of them. I mean, in addition, I try to put out media and do panels and do podcasts and try to talk about my story. But I think that something that every single person here can do and everybody in the world should do is work to foster conversations in smaller settings and make these issues something that can be talked about with anybody.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, so thank you all. I want to jump into questions. We have some questions from folks. I'm gonna look at these real quick. There's a question here for Jasmine. What kind of investments and resources and social community responses are needed to improve and eliminate violence?
Yes, so I saw that question pop up and I was like, well, it's a big question. We can have a whole conversation about this, but I'll try to summarize some of the top 3 go-tos. So eliminating violence as a whole, we really have to look at the foundations and the reason why such violence happens. So whether that's community oppression, that's lack of resources, policies that are more punitive than supportive, all those general things. Now, I don't want to spend too much time going into it because it is a heavy loaded question, but the top 3 things, and I wrote them down so I made sure I don't fall off track. The investment really has to start, and think of it less of funding, right? Because people automatically jump into thinking about funding as the issue, but more the action steps behind it. You can throw money and policies left and right, but what are you really doing at the heart to ensure that you're building these communities up? So 1, try to identify those leaders within the community that have what I call face or say or connections to the communities. You also want to make sure that these systems, so let's say it's a government system, police department, social service, healthcare, whatever the systemic way of providing care would be, that they are either building or rebuilding trust with said communities. And also the last one I was going to say is listen to the needs and the lived experiences of the communities that you're trying to serve. So one thing that we do, and I'll just focus on young people and ending dating violence, in the field of domestic violence, which has been around since the 80s, and dating violence hasn't been around that long. The first Teen Dating Violence Awareness Month, the movement, not the issue. The first Teen Dating Violence Awareness Month was in 2010, so it's only been 10 years. I've been fortunate enough to be a part of this movement since the very beginning. And one thing that I've always advocated was listen to the needs of young people. Find the allies within the advocates, like Aiden was saying, within those communities. Don't assume that they want a certain thing. Listen to what they're asking for. So if you have a policy reform or a conversation around funding or how to eliminate violence within a specific community or the world, and you're not having the key people at that table, your plan is already just throw it out the window. So I'm trying to summarize, and there's so much to say, but listen to people, identify the leaders, and make sure that you are building or rebuilding trust, because there's been a lot of hurt in many of our communities. And people who just come in and say, this is what we think you need, we don't trust them. So just like a healthy relationship, you have to build and respect trust. We need to build and respect trust in our communities in order to eliminate violence as a whole.
Thank you, Jasmine. Aiden, there's a question here for you. You kind of started to touch on this, but how does gendered stereotypes and ideas about masculinity affect talking about violence against men and boys?
I love that question because I think that it is think about the last time somebody talked to you about something that you completely didn't agree with, and they were so kind and compassionate, and they said things that resonated with you so much that you changed your mind. That doesn't happen too often for me. I don't know about all of you. I like to say that every single time you are lucky enough to get your mind changed, that is a gift. And I strive to give that gift and be able to really talk about and promote talking about these issues with young men. And I think that there is I think that there's a barrier up. A lot of times I'll meet groups of young men and boys, and all of them will be closed off, and we'll have to really work hard to open up and talk about how we are our own people and are affected by the gender system, to be able to move to a place where we can recognize how it's affected us. And so I'm not sure that answered the question exactly, but that's sort of my take on talking about these issues through masculinity.
Thank you. Question for Tani. Tani, you mentioned earlier that more stories are needed about people of color and resilience. Can you talk briefly about immediate justice and the role of the media to tell stories about IPV, intimate partner violence and sexual violence?
Yeah. So Immediate Justice is a nonprofit that I started while I was still a student at USC with two of my best friends. And we teach young women of color filmmaking with a social justice lens. Something we like to say is tell your story by any means necessary. So if you have a camera, you can film your story. If you don't have that, you have a pen and a pad, you can write your story. If you don't have that, you have a body, you can just shout your story, tell your story by any means necessary. And so, I think one of the things that I've always been invested in is this idea of culture shift. And so, before we can pass policy around ending violence against women, we have to change people's hearts and minds. And so that's the work of storytellers. Why do we believe the things that we believe? And so, you know, I think especially for young people, sometimes it can feel disempowering because it's like, how do I get a big enough platform to change people's hearts and minds, you know, because I can't be on TV. But if you just brainstorm and you're like, well, I have social media at my disposal, you know, like my t-shirt, like what I'm wearing is a form of media that is communicating something to people. You can start to think about what media is in really creative ways and see all the different ways that you're talking to people. And I think that's what Survivor Love Letter was for me. It was a moment when, as a young person, I felt incredibly disempowered, and isolated. And I was writing in my journal, and I wrote myself a love letter on Valentine's Day when everybody is writing love letters to each other. And then I tweeted it, and it went viral, and I met all these other survivors from all over the world, and they became my internet friends, and then they became my real friends. And I think as a young person, like that's kind of the magic of the internet. And you know, so I talk about it because it's like, to me it felt like magic, you know, where you can feel one way. And this was all happening from my bed. I was like too sad to get out of bed, and then I was like making friends all of a sudden and talking to people. And then since that point, that, you know, that was like, I started to share other people's love letters, because survivors started writing their own love letters and like just taking the project up on their own. You know, like I met somebody from Canada, some girl who just started putting up love letters all over her city. Okay. And then we became friends. And then some friends from New York who were muralists, they were like, let's make huge love letters on buildings. And I was like, yeah, let's do it. You know, so it was like to see love letters become murals, become songs. Somebody was dancing a survivor love letter. It was so wild to me to see it become all these other forms of healing for other people. I just felt incredibly grateful that it could be medicine in that way. And so to me, all of this is just living proof that like your story in your life matters, and your resilience matters, and is worth celebrating, you know? And so for people who are in the space who are survivors, like I always kind of feel like, you know, just the fact that you're here and you're alive, like that's enough. You know, and like that's worth having a fucking party for. You know. And that's why I'm always really happy to share spaces like this, because it's like, you know, friends who are like, oh, what are you about to do on a Sunday? And I'm like, I'm gonna have this great conversation with other people about ending violence against women. They're like, oh, that sounds so heavy. And I'm like, it's gonna be great fun. I cannot wait.
That's how I feel when I tell my friends.
Yeah, because this is the work, and it's like, it's so joyful for me when I'm meeting all of you. So
absolutely. So there's one more question that I think would be great to close with. Marquise and Kevin had asked, how can we, sorry, I'm like literally reading the question. How can we all be advocates and allies in a push to spread awareness about these prevalent issues? Who wants to start?
I'd love to dive in. I mean, there are specific actions that we'll plug in here, and maybe you all can send out in an email afterwards. Like there are actions you can take. There are two, AmnestyLA and from our women's co-group highlighted earlier, as did Jim, who's one of our Amnesty country specialists, that there are online actions for two women who were killed in South Africa, part of Right for Rights. So if you're participating in Right for Rights, which is the annual Amnesty event where we write like megatons of letters, right? Like make sure you're taking taking action for women rights defenders and for survivors and victims of gender-based violence. The other thing is, if you're part of Amnesty, is to fight for those types of cases to be included, right? That comes because of the good work of people like Jim and Alice, who have fought for a long time to make sure that those issues are talked about as frequently as we do other human rights issues and are taken as seriously as other human rights issues. So whether or not you're kind of like nerdy level 10 Amnesty and are part of those conversations, like you're definitely part of those conversations in your community, whether that's in your home, in your school, with your friends or whatever. And when you're having those conversations, making sure that you're including that gender-based violence is part of that, right? And I think, you know, Aiden said it so well, where when you're having conversations where you're talking with folks, like, you know, your community, you know, your audience, and you know what resonates with folks. And sadly for me, it's not usually snarkiness. It's usually actually trying to like meet someone where they are, call them in and ask them questions about if they say something that's sort of weird or like perpetuates rape culture in a way that they probably didn't mean, but like you need to say like, that was a weird, like, what did you mean by that joke? Or like, oh, when you say something like that, it sort of lands like this for me, right? Like having those conversations. So like literally in your day-to-day actions, that your life is a living testimony of trying to end violence against women and girls, ending gender-based violence. And that's as little as what type of media you're consuming and paying for and supporting, whose stories you're listening to and sharing, and then the conversations you're having every day, right? It also means like, you know, look up what a bystander training looks like in your community. I mean, right now we're all inside, right? But like, what does bystander intervention look like? And in every community that you're in, like there are rape victim advocates if you want to get involved with that, if that's something that you're called to do is work with survivors. And that's not for everyone, right? My partner does that. That's not what I'm really good at. So it's okay to have a different role, but there's lots of things you can do. So we'll put actions here that you can literally take action. One thing you can do is, if you are a voter in the United States, is you can call and harass and tweet and mail and put on a monkey suit and show up to tell your legislator to pass the Violence Against Women Act, which has not been reauthorized. This is the major piece of US legislation. It's not perfect, but it is the major piece of legislation that funds most of the type of programming like we've talked about today. And it has not been reauthorized, which is, if you had told me this a year and a half ago, I would have said it's impossible. Like it was like, it's the one thing in this 4 years that surprised me. So I'll put links to that, and making sure that the Violence Against Women Act, it doesn't leave women behind, doesn't leave survivors behind, doesn't leave LGBTI folks behind. So yeah, so just sort of incorporating it as best you can. And like, we'll put specific links too, like for sure.
Yeah, also I would just add, maybe, I think that striving to always live in a mindset that lets you understand and meet people where they are and have conversations and strive for empathy in every aspect of your life, making you like striving to become a person that upholds these issues and is a just person in general doesn't have to be, I don't believe it has to be through direct action and steps. I think that working on yourself and working to make yourself a upstanding person and a wise, just person is equally important for just making sure that the world moves in the right direction. And so I think that knowing yourself and just striving to be empathetic and kind is probably the hardest thing, but also maybe the most important thing.
Thank you.
If I could piggyback on what Aiden said, I was thinking about the one thing that you could do if you're interested in becoming an advocate, and that's, you know, take some time to assess why you're drawn to this advocacy and practice healing. For many of us, we all have a story. We have something, some moment in our life that is going to shift whether we go left or right. And for many of us, we also are really good at preaching healing and taking care of our communities, but we're not doing that ourselves. So if you're an advocate or an ally, I just wanted to add in there, on top of all of the action items and on top of the many things that you can do in the community, is take time to heal so you can be the strongest ally and you can help your community grow. And for many of us who have started the journey of healing, that's also setting a model. I will speak for my community, for the Latino community. Mental health is okay. Healing is okay. So if they see you doing it and you're in the lead, then you're already being an advocate while you're taking care of yourself. So I hope that made sense.
I will add that to the Asian community, mental health is also okay to take care of. It's definitely one of those issues that culturally, I think, is still something people are learning to accept and adapt to. But absolutely, what you said is 100% on point. Anyone else want to add to this before we close out? We good? All right, thank you so much. And like Tani said, I feel like this is a very joyful conversation. Yes, it's very, heavy, a lot of really important issues, and like we've barely cracked the surface in this. But the work is so important, and just by all of you being here, you are advocates. So thank you all for being here, those who participated. Thank you, Jasmine, Aiden, Tani, and Tara, so much. This has been so wonderful. We are the AmnestyLA chapter 1019 to be exact. And we have meetings once a month, and we have some exciting things coming up. So if you would like to learn more information, I think you're probably on our email list now since you signed up for this. But we hope that you'll join us for our monthly meetings, which are all virtual now, so you can literally be anywhere, which many of you are from different places right now, which is awesome. And join us. We've got some, like I said, we've got some exciting things coming up, and we'd love your support, love to engage all of you and see what else we can do to end gender-based violence. All right, thank you again. And I hope to see you all soon. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.